I'd now like to add in and introduce you to my very special guest, Ali Shamas Kadir, who's a graphic designer, a writer, and an educator, who's an assistant professor at OCAD. There's many, many things that we could speak about today, but we've decided to focus our discussion on Ali's experience bringing a refugee to Canada as part of Canada's private sponsorship of refugees program. So I will add him into the conversation now. And hopefully we won't have those technological challenges. Hello.
Hi, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
Good, good.
Good, I hope everyone can hear us okay. If not, please let us know and we'll try and make some adjustments. Thanks again for taking the time today. Do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Sure, thank you very much. My name is Ali Kadir. I use he, him pronouns. I'm born in Kingston, of mixed race background, and I teach at OCAD University in the graphic and industrial design department. And so as starting a few years ago, working with some friends, co-founded a sort of a group of community members to sponsor a Syrian refugee to come to Canada. And as a result, sort of went through the sort of sponsorship application process. And so I think have a lot to say in general about the process. Yeah.
I think when you and I were talking a few weeks ago, there were many things I think you're interested in that I'm interested in. We decided to focus on this because I've been reflecting a lot about it because of World Refugee Day, which happened a few weeks ago, and because of my own personal connection. My father came here as a refugee from Czechoslovakia during the late 60s. And at that time, Canada bent the rules to let refugees like my father in, who were, you know, white, educated, anti-communist, pro-capitalist. And so it was fairly easy for someone like my father to come in. And now it's not. And, you know, predominantly people of color fleeing violence are having a harder time coming to Canada, I think. And because of my own personal experiences as well, working in refugee camps, I've also been in Lebanon along the Syria border and spoken to folks living there, you know, in tented structures for many years. And, you know, it's been hard for me to see, because I think, you know, our current government, there's a lot of like, you know, Trudeau's put tweets out saying, yes, Canada welcomes refugees, and, you know, doesn't see the impact of that. But I've seen the impact of that because I see people's faces light up when I come to Canada, and then when I have to start to try to explain how challenging it is for people to actually come here, I can really see, you know, their faces start to fall. And so I feel very deeply and strongly about making it easier for folks to be able to come here. So yeah, I'm very interested to hear about your experiences. Maybe you could kind of just like walk us through the timeline of that process.
Totally, I'd be happy to. So the family of the refugee we sponsored arrived in our refugees' parents arrived in Canada around 2016, and upon their arrival, sort of my wife and I, we volunteered with the existing sponsorship group that sponsored them. We donated some money and some resources for when they came. And then not long afterwards, there was a commitment to try to sort of reunite the whole family together. So, but our friends who did the initial sponsorship sort of had reached their bandwidth. And so we started a new group with a few people from the community. We called ourselves Syrian Family Reunited, very literal name. And what we ended up doing is it was a really special group. It is a really special group of people because people who didn't quite like nobody quite knew each other, but we've all grown close over the years of it, through, just through working together in this way. And it's been really interesting. It's been sort of multi-generational and just a nice thing. So the group was struck up in early spring of 2017. We worked closely with a religious institution in Toronto to to co-sponsor, and then the process was sort of setting up a memoranda of agreement with the religious institution, then raising a sort of baseline amount of money that the government requires for a sponsorship group to raise for to ensure that the refugee has a year of basically of runway. And it's to be honest, that was really the money raising was the easiest part, it turned out, because I think everyone really wanted to, I think because maybe it's just the circles that we live in, but people just like wanted to support the sort of cause. But I then from then on in, it was sort of like there was sort of bureaucracy of sort of filling out forms and amending forms, and then the majority of the sort of 3-year period that it took was sort of spent, or 3+ years, almost 4 years, from sort of establishing the group to the arrival of the refugee. The majority of that time was sort of waiting for the sort of various parties along the bureaucratic timeline to sort of, we can approve these forms, therefore they can go to the parent organization. The parent organization can approve these or deny them, and they have to be amended somehow before they can go to the government. And then they sort of sit in a queue, in a governmental queue, and then there are sort of limits on the different types of sponsorships that there are. So yeah, the timeline was about I would say very close to 4 years.
Did you have any idea that it would or could take that long?
No, I mean there are clearly, we knew that it wasn't a like a multi-week process. We knew that it was going to be a multi-year process for sure, but we didn't. I think that there were bureaucratic and in like world catastrophic global event hurdles that we couldn't have foreseen, and we were sort of like under the impression that it would take maybe a year or so. I think the actual like ultimate timeline was much longer than we expected.
I think the cynic in me thinks dissuade people from trying to sponsor folks and try to bring folks in me. Do you think there's some kind of hiding behind the bureaucracy to make it harder for folks to try and do this, or is it really just like we need to do something about this bureaucracy?
It's a question that I ask myself a lot, I think, and I wrote that down in advance of our conversation today. I can't say for certain, but there is just an immense opacity to the process, just an immense opacity to the process, and I don't know how deliberate that opacity is. There are clearly steps to the process that there are like vetting steps to the process, which are I can see like as being a kind of requirement of a state institution, but the degree to which the process is difficult, like the degree to which the process is sort of made sort of difficult and fragmented, definitely benefits a sort of slowed down. Definitely benefits a kind of a slowed down process, or a slowing of the process, for sure.
Do you, I know you think a lot about user experience because of the work that you do. Have you thought through what could potentially, be a better user experience to have it more streamlined? Also, apologies, my neighbors are doing construction, if you can all hear.
Yeah, I do have some thoughts on it. So first, at the risk of undervaluing my profession, I actually think there aren't that many things in the world that can be solved with like quote unquote design, or capital D design, or especially when it comes to governance. I don't think that it's like a necessarily like a design problem in the sort of way that designers like to pretend that everything is a design problem. But here's some things that I do think could be improved greatly. I think like a clearer, much more comprehensive like government run information resource that doesn't just begin and end with the bureaucratic processes, but actually sort of would take possible refugee sponsors through the entire process, from forming a group all the way to the end of the first year of sponsorship, when they're sort of like their duties are officially over. Um, uh, and this could, and like like an online information resource that could help, pair potential sponsors with each others or with institutions. I think I do like the one designerly thing another designerly thing that I think could be sort of revisited is maybe secure online sort of smart form system or something. But I guess that raises the issue of privacy. I don't think that you can have like I think it would be a bit of a conflict to sort of have I guess storing your refugee application on a state-run platform necessarily, but I do think like some sort of secure method of storing and syncing drafts of like application, like of all of the forms that you have to fill out in some sort of way would really improve the process, because we were so bogged down by revision and so bogged down by like having to like fill out forms over and over again, that I think a PDF as like an information resource might be a little flawed. But I mean, ultimately, the main thing for me that I feel like that could just be improved is just money and resources that are devoted to the actual process. Like, we didn't have a liaison with the government that we could speak with as we were developing the process. That would have been, so in essence, it was sort of like filing something away and hoping that it worked out, but maybe not knowing for several months, but being able to like work closely with being able to work more closely with the government in terms of helping us through the process would have been amazing. Uh, and then, like the one other thing, and I think this came up in an earlier conversation with you in the past, is that it would be really great for this process to be streamlined to the point where it wasn't necessarily beholden to government favor. That there are letters and requests that you can make of politicians, or no, there are letters and requests that politicians can draft to sort of accelerate the process. And while that's like really appreciated, that suddenly becomes a sort of squeaky wheel gets the grease type of situation. That on more than one occasions we were generally civically engaged people. So I think, and entitled people. We're a bunch of entitled, civically engaged, overeducated people. So on more than one occasion, we were knocking on the doors of our representatives and asking for help, and when help was provided, it was deeply appreciated. But there's like, to require pathos to accelerate a process always felt, difficult, I think, in some ways.
Mhm. Yeah, and frankly, I mean, it isn't the role of members of parliament to do that kind of work if you really look at what the role is. And it does take away from the other work when, elected officials have to get involved in that bureaucratic process that should really run smoothly on its own.
Hmm.
Actually, I know there's a move in many kind of in healthcare, for instance, to move towards having service navigators or service navigation pieces. I think it would make a lot of sense in this case to have kind of a department that does service navigation, so that, yes, walks you through. You have one point of contact that walks you through that entire process.
That
Seems to make a lot of sense. And also somebody, yeah, your point person, they call and say, I don't understand this form, or, where is this form at now, would make a lot of sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's a really, I think I mean, that's the first time I've heard that term, but I actually I'm making a note of it right now. The idea of like service navigation would have been would have been just would have changed things, I think, in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. I'd love to hear a bit about the refugee that you helped to bring here. Can you tell us a bit about their story? Obviously not, not identifying too many things, but what you can share about them.
Totally. So I'm going to limit the amount of information I'll give, just because I haven't explicitly been given consent to talk about their story. But they escaped Syria at the outset of the civil war, when they were a teenager, at the sort of end of their teenage life, and or sorry, at their end of their teenagehood. and have since had traveled through the Middle East, and they've been through various parts of the Middle East, but never being granted, but always under sort of like various statuses but that were never like they were never granted like work permits, or it was always under a refugee status or something like that. So they've never actually had stable employment. They've never been had the opportunity to sort of gain stable employment or housing, or the thing that we thought about a lot is just the sort of in the formative moment when people sort of decide, when people sort of do their first sort of education, whatever form, whether it's vocational or humanities based or whatever, they didn't get that opportunity. And they're extremely skilled, they're extremely talented, but they have a really limited CV as a result of it, because just the jobs that they've been eligible to do haven't been towards building towards a career path necessarily. And they have they have stories of checkpoints and of living in hiding, and those aren't stories I'm not confident telling, because they're not really my stories, but also I'd be afraid of getting details wrong. But yeah, they ended up they ended up in one Middle Eastern country for the past several years, and sort of have just been really in limbo for multiple years in kind of like precarious housing situations, to waiting to sort of be reunited with their family, which they finally did in November.
Yeah, that sounds, I mean, it sounds like a lot of stories I've also heard. A couple years ago, I was in Bosnia, and a new route had opened up for folks who were trying to get to the EU. So it was along the Croatia-Bosnia border. Croatia is part of the EU, Bosnia isn't. And some of the folks that I met there had been traveling with their escaping really horrific conditions, and then had horrific things happen to them over those 3 or 4 years while they're traveling, moving, without any real status in the countries that they were moving through. And at that point, it also becomes really challenging. You can't just go from one of those countries to immigrate to another one. It becomes really challenging as you move out of your home country. So I'm sure there are lots of parallels there with them, and their experiences as well. And one thing I know from my own experience that's really challenging is after those many years of being in fight or flight, you're really just trying to survive, and you finally come here, and all of that, I think all of that stress, all the PTSD, the trauma that you've lived kind of comes back here, and then you're in this new space, maybe don't have a lot of connections here. What's it been like for them to kind of settle into life here, and considering the pandemic aspect, what would you say are the biggest struggles?
Honestly, the biggest struggle, uh, it's funny. I can't think of any ancillary struggle outside of the biggest struggle of arriving in Canada in November, in November 2020. I just think the biggest struggle of of arriving in a new place and trying to sort of acclimate to a new place in the middle of like, I think as the second wave was really taking off, so COVID-19 has been the biggest struggle, I think, in many ways. I think it's the alienation of being in a new place. There are resources for newcomers in Canada. There's language learning resources. There are community groups. There are support structures to help people to find work and figuring out long-term plans. There are communities. There are communities of people out there who are either from their home country, but there's also communities of people out there who are all coming in from new countries, who are all sort of like navigating a new society together. But really, all of that stuff was completely impacted by lockdowns, even like and so I think that it's been a really, it would say that it's been a really, really alienating experience in a lot of ways. that COVID, being in Canada, that like that all, sort of the ways that you sort of connect with people and the ways that you start to establish yourself in a place, all like you just have no access to any of it. So the example I always think about is sort of English classes that they've been taking. Uh, those English classes, they're like learning, like those English classes are virtual, so there's not even really like a cohort. Like I can speak for myself as a university professor. Like it is like establishing like a community of learners virtually versus establishing a community of learners in physical space. There's like one is you get to do the actual thing of establishing that community, and the other one is kind of a simulacra of that. Um, so yeah, all of these. So I feel like that has been really the biggest struggle on in a lot of fronts, because even the bureaucracy of getting a SIN number, of getting identification, driver's license, all of those things, they've been so severely impacted, and they've been so they've by necessity, maybe they've had to be automated in such a way that for an English language learner to be able to get these things done, it becomes very difficult.
What about the impact of the incredibly high cost of, housing mostly in Toronto, but living more generally? Has that been kind of or shocking or challenging?
Um, I think their living situation is they have managed to, I think, they've managed to move in with their family, so that's been really, so that has sort of been a good way to, that hasn't been as much of a burden on them, I would say. However, I would say that sort of we've had conversations where they've sort of looked out into like at the possibilities of like independent housing and whatnot, and just sort of being like, okay, so tell me about other cities in Canada, um, just because it's I think they were definitely surprised by it, but luckily they haven't. It's something that hasn't hit them quite yet.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I always actually feel like a bit of, bearer of bad news and really negative when I'm talking to folks in refugee camps about Canada and about what it's like, and just kind of trying to, I don't know, like prepare folks for the reality of what it is actually like here. It's not, yeah, I think when you're living something and you're not looking at it through a kind of a mediated lens of social media or TV or movies or whatever. But I do feel like a bearer of bad news a lot when I try and just kind of talk about the reality of what it is like for folks here, and who are coming here. That it isn't sort of this paradise, where everyone has access to Medicare and jobs and cheap housing. It's hard.
Yeah, it is. It's really hard, and if I'm not mistaken, I feel like housing, like the baseline of affordable housing is tied to market rate, but market rate changes from city to city, but minimum wage doesn't change from city to
Right.
city. So like, so when we talk about affordable housing in Toronto, we're get a lot more in Kingston for that same price. So and I also think it's also tough because I think that there is it's really important. I think for a lot of newcomers, I see the impact being also the child of immigrants, like to have sort of communities of people around you, and that oftentimes requires urban areas, and um, then urban areas become unaffordable, and yeah, so it can be a little vicious.
I think that there's, likely more service in large cities and cultural connections in the larger cities. But yet then you're stuck with the expenses of living in a larger city. So it's,
Hmm.
yeah. Um, I see that some more people are joining us, so thank you very much. I am speaking today with Ali Kadir, and we're speaking about his experiences bringing a refugee to Canada as part of Canada's private sponsorship program. I did want to, I know you and I have talked a bit about this, but I did want to talk a bit about, in light of the recent attack in London, I wanted to talk a bit about Islamophobia and what your thoughts are in terms of the impact of that on folks, Muslim folks coming here as refugees. I don't know if if you can speak to that, what your thoughts are about how that's impacting that population specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like I can speak. I feel like I can speak from a couple of positions. I think I can speak from the position as being, like a Muslim man, a descendant of Pakistanis, and seeing just like this horrific thing happen, and feeling very helpless and just generally scared for a lot of people and family. And I think and for just sort of, I feel like for Muslims everywhere, just, and I think that sort of like anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim sentiment is sort of on the rise. Um, the thing, this, I don't know, this, I'll say the thing that sort of went through my mind when this started to go through, and I don't know, people may disagree with me on this. I think I was sort of thinking also, I also was thinking about from the position of being kind of like a punk kid in the late 90s and the early 2000s, in living in Montreal and in Kingston and in Toronto. And I was sort of thinking about a little bit that the feeling of safety that immigrants feel. My theory is that the feeling of safety that people, that sort of like that these victimized groups feel is likely inversely proportional to the feelings of safety that the far right has to organize in the public sphere. So I mean, I think I sort of remember when the last time that sort of far right and racist groups were galvanizing in various cities around Canada, there was a really concerted, organized, on the ground approach to their opposition. I think about chapters of like the organization Anti-Racist Action, and they were on every campus and on every city. But because, but I think that largely that sort of that organizing is much less on the ground and more online, and maybe by virtue of being online and being sort of more sort of rhetorically based or message based, may not have as much efficacy as sort of groups that sort of actively sought to ensure that like Nazis didn't gain a foothold in various communities through all, like, every grassroots method I can sort of think of. I mean, I remember there were concerts every month of sort of like Rock Against Racism concerts. There were sort of like just a lot more of galvanizing of sort of youth and people on the street. But I guess that doesn't really answer the question. I think the refugee that I've helped sponsor, and I have not really discussed what's happened in London explicitly yet, but I do think the thing for me is just really collective response in public is really necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you're right in terms of the social media space and the online spaces. There's so much less control over what people are accessing. And you can put your messages out, as much as you want, but you don't necessarily know who's accessing that. So I think you're right, and definitely a multi-pronged approach is needed to combat this. Maybe we need to get more boots on the ground again.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to some anti-racism concerts. Yeah. I would like to ask if anyone on the line has any questions. While we still have you here, I did want to give you a chance as well, Ali, if there's anything that you did want to, that we haven't talked about yet. You
Yeah, I guess
to walk away from.
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah, for sure. I would say that if you have any bandwidth to, bandwidth to sort of get involved, to sponsor refugees, to sponsor a refugee if you have the means to, I think I would say do it. I think the process of sponsorship, it can be really difficult. I've talked about the opacity of it. I'm not gonna. We could speculate on the how deliberate that opacity is, but ultimately, I think that really the secret behind the process is that it takes sort of a kind of patience and a kind of grit for the bureaucracy. And I think that it's not a matter of like skill or talent. It is just literally the ability to kind of return to the process whenever you get frustrated by it. Like, and it's not, there's nothing innate, there's no talent, there's no skill set that you can learn around that necessarily. Like for me personally, I'm the least organized human being I know. And it was still, with the group that we founded, like we were still able to do a lot. So yeah.
Someone is asking to share a link for ways to support. What would be what's the best way if folks wanted to support?
So there are a few ways. I think one way I don't have any explicit links. I should have collected some links. I think if there are people that if you want to sponsor, I think there are a wide number of organizations out there that you can contact. I think most churches in Canada will have a sort of do what's known as community sponsorship. What's known as like a community sponsorship plan, where they partner with a community group that you would basically form. I think going through that would be that's a really good way to do it. I think there are like every community usually has like every community usually has like an immigrant services organization that offers like support, like for jobs, for careers, for classes, for advising,
Mm-hmm.
um, getting involved there, providing some financial support there. Those are really good ways to
Yeah, I know
start to become involved.
FCJ in
Yeah.
the well, that does support to refugees. Great. Well, thank you very much. I don't see any other questions. So thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate you taking the time. And thanks to everyone who joined.
Thanks for having me. Thank you very much for having me and letting me talk today.
Thank you.
Bye.